Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first of a four-part webinar series, examining how colleges are designing an equity-minded support experience that meets students where they are. My name is Julia Lawton, and I'm the Director of Holistic Student Supports here at Achieving the Dream. This webinar series is based on a series of 4 briefs examining the support needs of different community college student populations. The briefs were released in the second week of February, just before our annual conference, DREAM, and are available for download for free on our website. The links to these briefs will be provided at the end of this webinar. Community and technical colleges serve as the gateway for diverse student populations who have been historically underserved in higher education, but possess great potential. Colleges have the ability to redesign the student experience and create learning environments that remove systemic barriers and help students attain economic mobility. These briefs help inform these critical conversations that ATD network colleges are having about student success and closing equity gaps. So today's webinar is going to focus on the first brief in the series that examines what we're learning about effective implementation of holistic student supports. Throughout the webinar, I will share some of the key insights outlined in the brief and engage in a discussion with our panelists to dive deeper into each point. So here are our wonderful panelists and speakers for today. I'm joined by 2 wonderful colleagues at Achieving the Dream, Dr. Laurie Fladd, who is also a Director of Holistic Student Supports, and Jennifer Hill-Kelley, one of our Holistic Student Supports coaches. Laurie and Jennifer have decades of experience working at community colleges. Laurie herself has spent her career as a practitioner in the community college, serving in science and mathematics as an adjunct instructor, full-time instructor, department head and associate dean. Laurie served Trident Technical College in South Carolina as the Director of Academic Advising and the Project Director of the IPASS grant. As Project Director, Laurie and her team worked across academic affairs and student services to transform the student onboarding and advising experience. Jennifer has held many positions in higher education too, including as a project manager for student success at Northeast Wisconsin Technical College, where she facilitated collaborative cross-divisional teams of faculty and staff in development of an electronic academic planning tool, working to improve developmental education and also increasing alumni engagement. In addition, she was integral in launching diversity and inclusion training for faculty and staff with emphasis on expanding the use of data and evaluation for student success interventions. Laurie and Jennifer now both work with Achieving the Dream with colleges across the country to design and implement a holistic student supports approach that meets the needs of their student populations and their communities. I'm really excited to have them here to share what they're learning from the field about how to make these transformational changes effectively and with equity at the heart of this work. So first, before we dive into the content, I want to take 1 minute just to review how you can engage in the webinar. This is primarily a discussion. There will be a few slides, but this is a discussion aimed at getting to the heart of some of the core practices of effective implementation. So we really want you to drive the narrative and ask the questions that you'd like to get answered from these experts. So ask questions. You should be able to see at the top a Q&A box. And you can click on that and the box will pop up and you can ask questions directly to us. I will be monitoring those questions throughout. We are not leaving questions to the end. So as you have them, please send them to us and we'll address those at the right time. Alternatively, if you would like to share your own thoughts with attendees or privately with us, you can use the chat box, which also you should be able to pull up at the top of your screen. Great. So before diving into exploring the implementation, I want to lay a bit of groundwork about what we mean by holistic student supports, just so that we're all on the same page. So Achieving the Dream has been working with colleges to redesign their student support services for many years now in various different forms and through various different grants. And what we typically see is a dedicated staff working to deliver the best service to students, but typically in isolation from each other. Information isn't always flowing easily between services or departments. Each department is typically unaware of what the others do for students. And faculty aren't always aware of the services available to them, and so on. And what this results in is pockets of excellence that don't necessarily talk to each other. So students end up having to navigate a complex suite of disconnected services, resulting in far too many falling through the cracks unnecessarily. So what we're working towards when we say holistic student supports is an experience in which students only have to tell their story one time. There's no wrong door through which a student can go to get the support they need. Obstacles or challenges to success are addressed before the situation becomes a crisis. And personal and financial supports are treated as academic issues and having an impact on student learning. To achieve this, student support services need to be designed and delivered as a cohesive suite of services that help students address all academic, financial, and life factors vital to retention and completion. This means more than setting up a large quantity of disparate services or improving the quality of one service, like advising, for example. The focus is more on how those services are connected together, how they are delivered to students, and how and when students get connected to relevant services. And while there isn't one model that we can tell colleges to implement and copy directly onto their own campus, there are a set of design principles that must be in place to reach a holistic approach. The support services must be sustained, which means students are connected to supports throughout their experience at the college. They must be strategic because we have limited resources and not every student needs all services or doesn't necessarily need deeper services than some others. Support should be integrated, and this is really critical to this approach. So a seamless experience for students demands that we integrate services and departments, technologies, data, and all the student success initiatives and committees that exist on our campuses. Supports need to be proactive so that we know what obstacles may appear and we connect students with those supports that can help them before things become a crisis. And then finally, supports need to be personalized. And when we say this, it means that students know who to go to get the support they need, and they get the specific type of support they need when they need it. So we know that student experiences matter, and what we've learned through our work is that student academic achievement is not isolated to math, science, or language ability. It's reflective of the beliefs, preparation, and lived experience, access to health and learning resources, and the financial income of the student's family. Simply put, students that have the benefits of a foundation that gives them greater opportunities in life tend to do better. Students who have not started out in life with those benefits have a harder time catching up and completing their dreams. When students step foot on campus or in the classroom, they don't check their identities and experiences at the door. The whole student shows up, yet too often financial and life experiences or challenges are treated as isolated from academics. And in fact, we know that students are more likely to drop out because of those factors than because of the rigor of the learning process. A holistic support experience that follows the design principles, embraces the complexity of student lives and meets them where they are. Moving to this approach requires the institution to examine how structures, processes, and attitudes across the system of supports impact the student experience and student outcomes. It demands that institutions take ownership of their structures, processes, and attitudes, and the impact that they can have so they can move to make big changes where those are needed. And equity is at the center of owning our structures, processes, and attitudes. And we have to be intentional about that because challenges to equity show up at all three levels of these changes. So for example, we often hear statements like, well, we offer this support service, but students aren't using it. And while this may be true, there are myriad reasons why this may be the case, some of which are within the control of the college and some that maybe aren't. The structures, processes, and attitude framing helps to examine what the college is doing or not doing that is contributing to this reality so they can address those issues. And we have a couple of examples of questions that colleges can ask on the screen right now. For example, some structural questions are, is our use of physical space welcoming to the students we serve, or are we putting them off so they don't want to use the service, or they don't feel comfortable or welcome using it? An example of a process question is, when are our services offered? Do students who take night classes or weekend classes not have access to those same services? An example of attitudinal questions to ask is, how do we build trust with students who may be socialized not to trust authority or ask for help? So after 3 years of working with colleges across the country to design and implement a holistic student supports approach, we've learned quite a bit about what contributes to the effective implementation of this approach. The 3 core recommendations presented in the first brief of this series are to move beyond the initiative or the siloed mindset that leads us to making changes to services in isolation of each other, to really get to know who your students are and what their experiences are, so you can design your structures, processes, and attitudes to meet them where they are, and to practice facilitative leadership, no matter what your role is at the institution. So we'll spend the remainder of our time together diving deeper into each of these recommendations. So I'm going to shift, and we are going to stop sharing the screen, and we're going to turn on our webcam so you can see our faces. And then we'll have a discussion. So we'll start with moving beyond the initiative mindset. And as we've discussed, a holistic student supports approach should prompt colleges to reimagine the work they already do to support the success of their students and the role they play in the broader system that affects their students' lives. It means understanding the components of the system and how they relate to each other, and then making changes that will prompt the system to work more effectively towards its goal, which is student success. Ultimately, systems change is about shifting the conditions that are holding the problem in place. And for this to work specifically, for holistic student supports, it means transforming the system that defines the student experience, and it involves transforming the relationships between people who make up the system. An example we share in the brief relates to Amarillo College. You may have heard of them. They've been nationally recognized in many, many places for their No Excuses Poverty initiative. And while they have been lauded nationally, and their work is being adopted or replicated at other colleges across the country, the success of their work is dependent on their ability to address the full system that impacts the student experience in terms of academics, life, and financial supports. And they went further to understand how the system outside the college can be leveraged to better support their students. Rather than provide all of the supports to students themselves, Amarillo set up partnerships with more than 60 local nonprofits to fully meet the needs of their students, many of whom experience intergenerational poverty. Yet Amarillo College is not the only institution taking a systems approach to their work. So we'll now hear from Laurie and Jennifer about their experiences working with colleges on moving beyond this initiative or siloed mindset. So my first question to Laurie and Jennifer is, what does it look like when you see or work with colleges that move beyond this initiative mindset and towards a systems approach to their student support redesigns? And can you give an example of how this might change the work that they do? And so I'm going to ask that to Laurie first.
Great, thank you, Julia. So one of the ways that I see colleges move beyond the initiative mindset is to work less siloed at their institutions. And so that may involve bringing a broader group of stakeholders to the table as they address a problem. For example, if they're working on advising redesign, to pull together both the student services folks and as well the faculty side of the house to work at the same, to work together at the table to design the best approach for the students that they serve. And because when they do that, they create less isolated interventions and they create approaches that are going to work better for the students that they serve. So that's one way that I see that work really, really well at institutions.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jennifer?
One of the things that I've seen at colleges that help kind of break down the silos after you bring people together to work collaboratively is learn from each other. They, the communication is sometimes not flowing in every direction. And so by just having people in the room together, sharing what they do, they learn a lot about what's happening. And so in one college in Arkansas, they're doing a great job at, pulling together this collaborative team, but then taking that further, getting to know their students and using that to drive what happens next. So using, bringing IT involved, looking at their existing technology to see how they can leverage that to help them implement the changes they're trying to make.
Great. Great.
Can I add one more thing there, Julia?
Yes, you can.
So I actually think I think Jennifer is spot on with that. And when colleges take that time to know, I think we don't realize how little we really understand what goes on in some of our colleagues' offices, just because it's not because we don't want to, but just on a day-to-day, we're so busy. And I've seen colleges use like internal professional development days very creatively that way to understand and learn about what goes on in other offices and just to get a broader understanding of how other offices function. So
great. And there's a lot of different ways you can structure it beyond one-off professional development days as well. And it gets to the specific culture of the organization as well. So it has to be tailored. So how did colleges make the shift to a systems approach in this work? Shifting from just thinking by initiative, by department, and moving towards this more kind of systems approach to this work. I'm going to ask Jennifer.
So, part of it is intentional. I think sometimes there can be triggers, and they can come with staff changes. They can come with grants, opportunities that come up. So if you can't get them to self-initiate from your own effort, those things can be helpful in moving the work forward if it needs to be done. So then the systems change really becomes when you have different folks involved, and then you can tie these things to the bigger picture of the strategic plan, and kind of fit this work underneath what the college is already doing. And a lot of times, when this communication starts, you learn about these different initiatives that are happening, and then you can decide who else needs to be in the room, or who else needs to be a part of this conversation, which can help move the work forward as well.
Right. Laurie?
So I agree with Jennifer. It's very much about intentionality, and I have seen colleges do this well when they approach the work from a whole college perspective, understanding that it's not just one department's job to transform the student experience, because that's actually probably not going to be terribly effective to redesign advising, and expect that alone to transform the student experience as they're moving through perhaps their onboarding journey. And I've also seen colleges be very intentional about how teams are structured. For example, I work with the college very closely where their academic VP and their student services vice president work. They guide the work together, and they lead the work, their redesign work together. So you have both the in and out of classroom perspective for what the student may need going into the design of the work as well. And then I've also seen college leadership very intentionally hire folks for those roles, understanding that it's going to be critical for those roles to work together. So they're very intentional about who fills those roles when they have that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And Laurie, can you talk a little bit very briefly about the communications mapping work that you've done with colleges? Because I feel like often one of the biggest learnings that comes out of that kind of examination is that each department that's involved in sending communications to students, particularly via email, they really don't realize how many their own office is sending out necessarily. And then when they see that combined with the communications coming from others, it always feels like it's a big eye-opening moment.
Absolutely. So that experience we take colleges through, we encourage them to bring together stakeholders across the college that communicate with students throughout the year. And then we map out each message each month, which ends up, and you can map, traditionally what we've done as we've mapped what goes in the student inbox, so they can look and see how many emails the students receive from across the college. And and Julie's absolutely right. It's very much an eye-opener to see, first of all, the volume of the emails that go to students from across the college. But then also it's really interesting to see the kinds of messages that are coming out of different offices. It's a way to learn how other offices across campus are speaking to your students. It's also a way to find duplication and see where you may be telling students the same thing out of different offices. But it does help almost in a visual way conceptualize the college as a system and how it communicates to the student.
Great. Thank you. So that leads us into the next question, which is, what tips and resources or questions could help colleges move towards the systems approach to their student supports redesign? And Jennifer, I'm going to ask if you can address that one first.
All right. So some tips that I think are very helpful is, thinking about where communication's already occurring, and the mapping is one place where I think, you get a good understanding of all the pieces in your system when you map that out. And so I think for looking at what you're already doing is the place to start. I know under the student-centered design, we call it the what is. And certainly because of resources, we want to use the things that we have in place. And that's part of the work that we do when we start this work, is to really understand what's in place, and then help you identify where you want to focus the change, because we don't have a lot of time or resources to do everything. That's a key piece of this. And as you learn from other areas, and there may be other influences as well, grants or things that kind of, or leadership priorities that influence what gets done. Part of this work to look at a system is to really understand what's in place, and then kind of look overall what can be done. And understanding the student is a key part of that next step, because that helps you prioritize where you want to focus and where you can have the biggest impact in this work.
That's great. That reminds me of some of the questions that we ask in the systems work with colleges, which is, I think the first one is really trying to get them to understand what the problem is and what the root causes are, but mapping it out is really good to help examine what aspects of the work you can control and what you can influence, and then things that you just aren't going to be able to address, and really helps you prioritize and focus your energies on those things you can control or influence. So Laurie, anything to add?
Yeah, so I agree with Jennifer. Absolutely. I think that mapping exercise is so helpful to really visualize what your system may look like, what you're including, what you're not including, things like that. We talked about the what is when we're looking at our systems and how things currently exist. Julie, you just mentioned identifying what problem you're trying to solve. And so that was something that I had when I was thinking about a tool that may help a college make that shift. That exercise, I feel, is really helpful to look and see, as you identify a problem and really start to look deeper into the patterns at your institution that are perpetuating the problem that you're seeing, what structures or processes are allowing the problem to persist, and then really the mental models that are being held by folks that are also contributing to the problem. And it just takes it takes that symptom that you're seeing and it really expands the view to the entire institution and maybe even beyond the institution into the community to understand that it really is, it's a systems approach as opposed to just trying to, put a Band-Aid on a symptom. So.
Great.
So one more thing, Julia, I want to add about this is, as we do this work, so we build a team that kind of leads the work, but the communication to the rest of the college is really key to helping move this to be systems work. So they don't work in isolation, even and they're cross-functional. There's communication with leadership. There may be communication at in-service or some sort of regular sharing of what's being learned by the team, because that's where you get to the attitudinal change, and the culture change is trying to bring people along when you can in this work.
Yeah. And I know we're probably going to talk about tips in a little bit, but since Jennifer mentioned that, I was actually just with a college this past week, and they're doing such great work, but they're not yet sharing it across the college. And they wanted to get just one more thing, a piece of data before they share it. And I think we get really nervous about not having the communication sound just right or perfect, or we don't know all the answers yet. And I think you can't let that keep you from sharing what's going on, and keeping people informed and not being afraid to say, I don't know quite yet what this looks like next, but I promise I'll come back and talk more when we have more details to share. So I just wanted to add that as well. I think that's important.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we know when there's gaps in communication, they get filled by rumor.
Right.
That's very well documented and probably experienced by a few people on this call, I'm sure. So it's important to have that kind of open and honest and proactive communication. So let's move on to the second recommendation, which is knowing your students in depth. So too often, as we saw earlier, students fall through the cracks because they're not connected to the services that they need when they need them, even though those services are actually offered on the campus. And there's a plethora of reasons why this happens. The student may not be aware of the service, they may not know how to access it, they may be fearful or ashamed to access the service, it may not have been scaled to all of the students, they may have had a prior bad experience with the service or with a similar service, or they may just not understand the value of it. And there's plenty other reasons. But what they all have in common is that the college actually has greater control over them than is typically acknowledged. So a student-ready college will flip that statement, students don't use the services we offer, and say, how do our policies, practices, communications, and culture contribute to students not getting connected to these services? Knowing that you can't control everything, but really focusing on what is within your sphere of control or influence. So one example of how a college approached getting to know their students more in depth beyond the typical demographic data that colleges do collect, particularly if they're in the Achieving the Dream network, is at Northeast Wisconsin Technical College. And they set about quite a few years ago, creating a simple set of questions that students would complete as part of the college application. They call it their intake survey. And many other colleges have adopted an intake survey of their own since then as a low-tech way to get to know who is coming onto their campus. So it identifies, the reliability of students' transportation, whether they're caring for children or providing care for a relative or a friend, how many hours they work, and their comfort level using computers. So that, and they design processes on the back end of that to be able to use the data to reach out to students as soon as they register and they apply to the institution, so they can preempt any potential scenarios addressing those needs. So that's just one example. As I've said, there's a lot of different ways colleges get to know their students. So let's talk a bit more about what those might look like. So first question to Laurie first. Why is it important when redesigning students that the college develops a deep knowledge of who their students are and what their experiences are beyond those key metrics that we all track?
So I think one of the reasons why is because those key metrics don't give us enough rich data about our students for us to really effectively design for them. And if we're going to, you know, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, if we don't have unlimited time and resources. So if we're going to design an approach or a solution for our students, it's really important to know who the students are that we're designing for. Otherwise, we could create an approach that it doesn't serve them well. So I think that's really, you want to make sure you understand the student you're designing for in the context of your institution.
Great. Jennifer?
I think, you know, one of the examples that came to mind with this question is a lot of people think they understand who their students are because of that may be who they interact with. I think what really this point is beyond the kind of disaggregation of data to really understand what their experience is. This is what's different about understanding when we talk about understanding your student. And so, you know, asking them how they want to be communicated with, as well as what their experience is when they come on campus, can inform how we redesign things. So, you know, if they're part-time students, you know, and will they come if we set up, you know, services till 7? You know, getting to that detail, I think is part of this work, because we can't leave it to assumption that we know what our students need. And so part of this work is really going further in understanding what their current experience is and how we can support them in the ways that they want when they come on campus.
Great.
And can I add one thing? I actually think, Jennifer, that's really important to get that information from the students, because I think you made a really good point. We, across campus, as we interact with students, we may interact with different types of students that come to our institution. So if you work, for example, if you work in the Veterans Office or the TRIO office, you may interact with students that may look different from students that you know, another office sees on another part of campus. So to pull the information from the students, I think, is a much more reliable source. It's not true, the students that we see, but I think to get a really complete picture, it's much more effective to get that information from the student.
And I guess if you're not getting it from the students, the gaps in information about student experiences can be filled by biases or assumptions that may not be rooted in truth. And so that could lead you to design something that doesn't work for those students who are really trying to help. And I think that's why the next 3 briefs in this series, we decided to focus on student populations that aren't necessarily currently tracked. So we're focused on student mothers, we're focusing on students that are enrolled part-time, even just in 1 semester, and then disconnected youth who aren't in employment or training or education. We wanted to do that because we know we don't necessarily have all the answers, but we need to start having this conversation about who they are, what they're experiencing, and why they may not be getting through despite our best efforts so far.
Good point.
So my next question is, what simple practices or tools can colleges employ to learn more about their students and their experiences without necessarily needing a lot of money, technology, or time? And that's a big ask because everything costs money and time. But what, are there simple tools and processes or tips that you could offer? And I'm going to ask Jennifer first.
Yeah, so one college that I worked with, they made a conscious effort in kind of their orientation period with advising to create a simple, I think it was like 3 questions that they asked their students. They compiled it and used that to help focus their advising redesign. And so that's one, you know, advisors are already engaging with students, they're already talking to students, and the matter, what they had to build was to normalize the questions they were asking and to gather that information and roll it up. And so that takes a little bit of time. It didn't take any extra system or technology. So that's one simple thing. The other simple thing that I really like that I'm seeing more and more colleges do is kind of the on-the-wall dry erase board with a simple question that students can walk by and write on the board. I think that's, you know, for certain, it won't work for everything, but I think it's a good, easy thing to do. The intake surveys those are kind of the hot thing now. Colleges want to do those. They have varying degrees of technology to do that. You know, there are some homegrown type of opportunities, and the key thing with that, even if you ask just a few questions, the important thing is what do you do with that information? That you build a system, you know, to get those responses attached to an action. And so, you know, that's doing that, trying it, I think is a good effort even before you kind of invest in a technology type like early alert, that it moves into action, and then that you actually capture it, record it, so that others behind the scenes within the college can learn from it as well. It's in the student record, so that the student doesn't have to tell somebody this information again.
Great. Laurie, any simple tips from you?
Yeah, so I think that, so in the toolkit, it's actually on page 28. I know this because I've used it a lot.
The holistic student support
the holistic student support redesign toolkit. There is a one-page exercise on questions you can ask colleges and work with at your institution on digging a little deeper behind the traditional, you know, demographic boxes that we check for students and the data that we submit. You may not, all of those different categories may not apply to every institution, but I think I'm also a real proponent of trying to find out, do you really have more data than you think you do? So are there other offices that perhaps hold data? For example, do you have a TRIO office, or different state funded priorities may require the collection of data? So you may actually have data sort of tucked away in different offices that you could make good use of to know your students a little bit better across campus. Another sort of fun strategy to get students to engage, and this works well. I've seen colleges do this with students when they're trying to figure out how they want to be communicated with. They'll find a class that usually has a pretty broad representation of students, like maybe a first year experience type class, and they'll just put a quick pop-up outside, you know, a desk or something outside of that classroom, and as students come out, they'll have snacks or some sort of takeaway that the student can take for them answering 2 or 3 questions. How do you want to be communicated with? Break down, you know, emergency information, important college, you know, sourced information, or, you know, fun student life information. And you can get really good responses in a short amount of time without it. I know it's not terribly scientific, but it really does get you the information that you need to get the job done. So,
yeah, great. I want to re-emphasize your point about what data do you currently have and how do you use it, because we do often, we have a lot of colleges that we work with that complete the SESI every 2 years or every years, that are, and more of them are doing the kind of basic needs surveys that are out there. There are multiple different versions. And the key question is, who gets access to that data and how is it used? So many times it stays within leadership and it doesn't necessarily get the benefit of the brain power of the whole community to be able to address some of the challenges that arise through that data. So I think that's a really important point, and it's not necessarily a simple practice, but it's affordable and you've already got so it's important to do. So how and when can the data about knowing who your students are, the full depth of understanding of who they are, how can it be used in the design and decision-making processes to ensure that changes are meeting the needs of students? I'm going to ask Jennifer first.
So the example I'd like to share is, so they've learned about their students, they've tried something out, and now, you know, part of the student-centered design is to prototype it, to test it out, and that's a key part where you need to go back to students to say, to check that what you're implementing is actually what you think you're implementing. A lot of times what I've learned and what I've heard colleges have learned is about language that we use in forms. In one college, you know, the font on their forms was a problem. I mean, you know, things that seem obvious, but they're not, because, you know, there's different people working in different areas on these things. So to test things with students to make sure that they're as effective as you hope they are. I think that's real important to go back to students, and not campus wide, but through focus groups or some sort of targeted feedback. It's real important. And the language, I can't emphasize that enough, to take a good look and audit kind of both through an equity lens and kind of a middle class language lens. What words are we using to communicate with students?
Mm-hmm. That's great. It's the Gunning Fog Index, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is used for auditing communication and language. So that's a great tool that's out there and available. Please don't talk to me about fonts. I have lots of feelings. We'll be here. I'm going to move and ask. We've got a question from an attendee, but I just want to throw that one to Laurie first, and then we'll address that.
Sure. So just really quickly, I've worked recently with a couple of universities in New Zealand, and I've seen them make really good use of student personas. So taking the data that they collect from and about their students, both quantitative and qualitative data, and constructing a persona of a student. This is based on multiple characteristics of different students. It's not a particular student, individual student. But then they use that as a tool when they are designing, so they really understand the student well, and the student that they're designing for. Another thing about personas, they are a great tool to use when you are working and communicating with folks that may not have a lot of frontline experience, face-to-face experience with students. So it's a really good way to introduce somebody that may not be as familiar with your students, to introduce them to your students.
Yeah, that's great. A little plug here, if you would like to develop student personas, we have a free template and we're happy to share it. So just my email will be in the slide deck, and you can contact me and get that if you'd like it. So the question from one of our audience members is, our struggle is in the timing of administering a new student intake survey. Is it at orientation, sent as part of the application process, during an advising appointment, or during an FYE course, a first year experience course? Are there any best practices on when to administer these? Okay, either one of you.
So I would ask a question back, and you know, what is the goal of the intake survey? Is it to connect students with particular services? So then I would lean toward the earliest possible point to gather that information. Mm-hmm. So if it's just to know, like, technology, how capable they are with technology, or how their communication preferences, I would move those after, further along, maybe orientation or advising or the first experience. I don't know, Laurie, if you have a thought.
No, I would agree with you, Jennifer. I think you're right. I think knowing the purpose of your intake survey is really, it's a great first question, because and I agree, if the goal is to connect students to supports, or as early as you can connect with them, is the best. I know a lot of colleges, for reasons, system reasons, can't attach things to their applications, but I have seen colleges who really need students to have it early, to maybe follow up so customize the communication that goes out to students after the application is received. And it says, thanks so much for your application. We're so happy to have you on board. Your next step is to click this link and fill out this information. And students don't know, it may not be mandatory. If they get that and it's the next step, then I've seen colleges have pretty good luck with that. But I agree, if it's something that's much more informational, a good way to collect additional data, it doesn't have to be that early, and you can then stretch it out a little bit so it's not right up front when students are dealing with a lot of other information.
Right. So the other thing about that is that gets to the overall communication plan. So, you know, as part of this work, maybe you identify that you're going to grab some of this information early at the first point, but then your plan, you would identify these other opportunities that you have along the way to get this other information, because there's lots of opportunities to engage with students. And we haven't even talked about the classroom yet.
Right.
So, but laying it out as a plan of when to get it, I think is a very good question. So that already tells me that they're thinking about, you know, timing of how to do this work. So it's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
There's a couple of other, there's at least one consideration I'd like to put out as well, and that's advisors currently at community colleges and probably for the foreseeable future don't have a lot of one-on-one time with students, and often that first visit may end up being the only visit they get with that student, particularly in that semester. So really think if you're considering using that time for students to complete the survey in person with someone, consider whether some of it can be done earlier by the student before they get there, so the conversation can be the focus of that in-person time. We have had a couple of colleges that had the advisor administer the survey, and so basically ask the questions and input the data themselves. And I think while that can, at least with some students, really be a good prompt for a conversation, it does take a lot more time. And so it's not as easy for advisors to really go deep in the conversation in that first meeting. So it's just another consideration. Okay. So if there are any other audience questions that come through, I will get to them, but right now there is nothing so far. So finally, let's move on to the facilitative leadership, and that is harder to say than you think. So holistic student supports redesign is a people-driven adaptive change effort that demands effective leadership at all levels of the institution. It cannot be achieved by the senior team or the president's team alone. So leaders with influence across the college are just as important for institution-wide changes to structures, processes, and culture as leaders with formal authority. Yet the leadership approach of those with the most authority does set the tone, and the culture will define the success or lack thereof of the redesign. Too often, and this is a shout out to Laurie for this, senior leadership sees its role as setting the vision and then moving out of the way for others to take the work forward. Laurie's shout out is that she calls this the blessing of the fleet, and it is what we do see quite often, well-intentioned leadership, but it doesn't necessarily work in this instance because it is systems change and it does touch the whole college. So facilitative leadership is a practical and effective approach to leading this type of change. It embraces the hierarchy that is built into the college while leveraging the power that lives at the top to create the conditions that enable others to actually contribute their own skills and expertise. There's a couple of core elements that need to exist. Obviously, trust is one of the most critical factors. Active listening skills, but practiced with humility, so that the listener and the leader really accepts what they're hearing and doesn't internally challenge it. A culture of inquiry and the ability to ask the right questions, which again is harder than you might think. And then clear and fair decision-making processes, again, another very important piece. So my first question, I'm going to send to Laurie. What does good leadership for holistic student support to redesign look like in your experience? And do you have an example or two you could share?
Yeah, so I think you made a really good point, going beyond just that general permission to do the work and then stepping out of the way. I think a lot of times, and I think for leadership, that is an attempt to not micromanage, which, as you know, I think we all appreciate not being micromanaged, but it's important to have a deep understanding of the work and understanding that there are probably going to be some very deep systemic changes. You may have an organizational a structure, org structure change. You might have job description changes. Those kinds of, and that requires leadership at all levels and support at all levels. So I think you can't just give permission to do this work and then step back, because some of those changes are big and they need the additional guidance. I also think not being too attached to the solution is good leadership there, because then you allow the solution to unfold as you learn about how it's working, and not being too terribly attached to it allows it to develop and sort of evolve over time. So just two strategies.
Great. Jennifer?
Well, I think that part of the blessing of the fleet is really kind of understanding or communicating clearly the why to everyone, and to emphasize that continually as the work continues. So that's that communication loop for the team that's doing the work, that's leading the work, to inform leadership what's happening, so that they can continually explain why this is important, what we think we're going to benefit, how it's going to benefit our students, you know, and to clear the path for all the other things that are happening day to day on the college. This work involves, you know, cross-functional teams that have full-time jobs. That at a real practical level is why I think communication is key, so that leadership feels like they know what's going on, they're regularly updated, and they can deliver the message that, you know, we're all in this together, we're all going to make change together, it's going to be messy, you know, as this work starts and continues. And
to build on what you're saying, Jennifer, the why doesn't have to be the same for everyone. One of the things we recommend when you're thinking about how to communicate, and this isn't just necessarily for this kind of work specifically, it can be used in all aspects, but think through what that person or that group you're going to be communicating to, think about what they value, think about what they care about, what motivates them, and communicate for that. But also think about what their responsibility is. Mm-hmm. Faculty may feel like they have a responsibility for their course. So how is that going to be impacted? How is what they are held responsible for in their position going to be impacted by the work that you want to do? Hopefully in a positive way. And then that is a really good tip for communicating upwards as well, and across the organization with people who you don't necessarily work with on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. Something that we consider at our work as well. Mm-hmm. An effective approach. There is a question asking about the font problem, so let's just quickly first. So I would like to hear about what the font problem was very quickly.
So the font problem was actually in the communication, the bills to the student, it was microscopic. So the computer system didn't make the font large enough to make the communication to the student as effective and interesting and particularly important to the student. So anyway, mm-hmm. That was what it was.
And there are also ADA compliance.
Correct. Yes.
For fonts.
Very important point.
Yes, very important. So my next question, and I realize we've only got a few minutes left. So what skills or practices have you seen leaders across the organizations you work with who are working on holistic student supports redesign employ to effectively lead and motivate or empower other individuals across the organization?
I'll take that one first. I have a great example. One of the best things that I've seen is to decide how decisions are going to be made before you get too far in this work. So it's a conversation about these. So say for instance, there's a recommendation about a redesign of a position. So it may be a job description change. So clearly laid out. If we come to a recommendation about a job description, this is how the decision should be made. Personnel issues need to be raised to the next level to take into HR very explicitly. So the team knows what they're empowered to do. So it could be, you know, changing hours of service delivery, right? How would that decision be made? So having those conversations a little before you get into the having made a recommendation is very helpful, both for the team and for leadership to know, understand the scope of the work that's ahead.
Great. Laurie?
Excellent. So I have seen colleges that are doing this well. Their leadership is giving the teams space to take risks, helping them not be afraid to fail, and helping them understand that this is going to evolve over time. And so things that might seem like a good idea at the start, after you practice and implement a little bit, maybe it's going to need to be iterated on, you know, and improved and evolved over time. So I think having that flexibility and gives a little bit of freedom to be creative. So I think the guidance from the top that gives you the freedom at the grassroots level to really be creative with the work is really important. So I feel you can feel that at colleges when you walk in and they have that freedom to do their work that way.
Yeah. And there's an example of that from, again, it's Amarillo College in the brief. And it's, so President Russell Larry Hart's leadership is very much facilitative in the way he does it. And he inspires all of his personnel to kind of do what is in the best interests of students. And he's very clear about the fact that they have the decision-making ability within what's in their control to do what's best for students. So an example he shares quite a lot is of a night custodian who I check as Robert Adams, who seems wonderful, who allowed students to seek shelter in a college building while he was cleaning it, and worked with their advocacy and resource center to provide these students with food. And that was without permission. He did it without permission, and then he did report it so that they could address it at a more systemic level. But that night custodian felt like he could make that decision even when that wasn't necessarily the standard protocol. I think that is a really good example of facilitative leadership in action. Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left. As you can tell, we could talk about this all day. I'm going to ask that we turn the videos off and I will share my screen so you can get access to the resources. Okay. So on this slide, and we will send these out, you can see some relevant resources. The briefs are in there. It's the second one down. There's 4 briefs. And you can download those for free. There's no wall that it's hiding behind. And then the resource that Laurie mentioned before, the Holistic Student Supports Redesign Toolkit, is also available for download. It is a 10-chapter, 8 appendix beast of a document, and it is really intended to be a guide for people who are doing this work. And again, that is freely available to download from our website at that link. I've also included a couple of other resources that might be of interest to you, so we hope that you'll explore them in your own time. Another quick shout out, we have an annual conference we host, an institute on this every year. The dates are on the screen, October 6th through the 8th, 2020. Location is not yet decided, but we'll share that as soon as we have it. It's really designed for teams who really want to come and work on a problem that they're having, whether that's implementation or about this improving the student experience. And you get access to an expert who will help facilitate you through those team times where you can actually work on the problem that you're trying to address. And then finally, there are 3 webinars left in this series. Every Friday in March, we will be hosting one of them at the same time, 1 o'clock Eastern time. So the next one on Friday the 13th is the Gateway to College for high school students. So this is focused on how you can help students who are disconnected from education and workforce get to college and complete their high school and then get to college. The third one in the series is on March 20th and is focused on increasing success for student mothers at community colleges. And the final one will take place on March 27th, and that's focused on supporting the success of students enrolled in college part-time. You can register at the links on here, and again, we will send these out. So finally, as you can tell, we could talk about this all day. So if you have questions or you want access to additional resources, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'm more than happy to help get you connected to whatever you need to make your holistic student supports redesign effective. So with that, we're going to end the webinar, and we hope to see you next week on the next one. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much.